Has anybody around here seen those killer horns?
I haven't had any experience about them.
I haven't seen them either.
I'm glad. I'm shocked.
All right, good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started for the evening. If you join us for the first time, welcome. We are probably about halfway through our Bible study for our Midweek Bible study this quarter, and we have been discussing and studying the topic of prayer and how it relates to the biblical examples and what we can glean from it today. And we've kind of meandered through several of the different examples and instances of prayer in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And now we found our way to the topic of fasting. And last week we were discussing the Old Testament, several examples, not all of the examples, because it would take us several weeks probably to cover all of the examples and also study on this topic. Hopefully everyone has been reading up on this and you're familiar with these verses. I picked out several last week and we discussed those. We moved on to the New Testament. We talked about several of Jesus' teachings and his instruction on fasting, and that's where we're at this evening. About halfway through this study here. So Lord willing, we will wrap up the topic of fasting. Hopefully we will glean much from it, and we'll have a newfound appreciation for it, and even possibly incorporate it into our normal Christian life, or we'll see, and we'll have that discussion. Before we go any farther, Steve, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Our Heavenly Father, Lord God, we're thankful for your word and opportunity to study it. We're thankful, Lord, that your word is indeed living and able to change the lives of folks, and we understand that it's important, how important it is for us to come together, to study together, to grow encouragement from each other, and we pray that we're able to do all those things tonight as we look more intently at your word. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. Now, before we get to the topic of fasting, why is it important for us to have a study like this, a study on prayer and the things surrounding prayer?
I think it's topics you don't hear a whole lot about.
Okay.
And they're very important topics.
Anything else, Janice?
Well, it's important that we know how to be pleasing to God.
Right.
Everything that's in the Bible, we need to search out and see, so we'll be the Christians that God would have us be.
Sure. Just like a warrior or some sort of skilled person at a tradesman, they will be skillful at their tools. Whatever tools they have. If it's a warrior, maybe a sword, or nowadays a gun of some sort, or something like that. For a tradesman, it could be any sort of tools, and they have to be adept at these things to be skillful and to have quality craftsmanship and these sort of things. Our tools as Christians are myriad. One of them, and one of the most powerful ones we have, is prayer. It is our direct communication to our Creator. And as Janice said, we want to make sure that when we're approaching Him in the way that He has instructed us to, and that we're being pleasing to Him, because He doesn't need our prayers. We're not praying for His benefit. All of this is for our benefit. And hopefully at the end of this class this evening, we'll have a understanding and much greater understanding about fasting. Okay, so we left off last week in Matthew 9. We were in Matthew 9, and this was the account where the disciples of John were seen fasting, the Pharisees or the scribes, whoever is approaching Jesus at this time, they're saying, hey, why aren't your disciples fasting? And what is Jesus' reply to them? Steve?
Because there's really not a reason to fast at the time.
Okay. He said when the bridegroom is here, right?
Right.
There's, what's that? Right. So what is he implying there? The lesson is that there is an appropriate time, and this is found in Matthew 9:14 through 17, for fasting. We see through this teaching here, and also when fasting would have a place in the disciples' lives, but only at the appropriate time. So Jesus is saying, in the future, my disciples will be fasting when I am gone. And that's what he's saying there. And right now, while I'm here, there's no need of that. And so what else is this point to? What else is this implying? That as far as the purpose of the fasting? Janice.
For mournfulness,
Okay.
sorrow, heart,
Okay.
despair, wailing.
Right. So it's associated with some sort of sadness or mourning, and especially the illustration he gives. He's talking about a party. He's talking about they're having a celebration. This is the groom, and he's here, and we're having a party, and this is not the time for fasting, right? And so we see that it's connected to certain things, and we've been seeing that throughout the Old Testament, and we're going to see it a little more here throughout the rest of the New Testament accounts that we're going to bring up. So the next one, any other comments on Matthew 9 before we move on? Okay, I know we covered it pretty good last week. So Matthew 17. Matthew 17 is where we're going to be at. If somebody wants to read Matthew 17, 14, around verse 14 through 21 is right around where we're going to be.
And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? He said to them, Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have the seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.
One more verse there.
As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, The Son of Man is about.
I think the translation you had has omitted the verse there.
Yeah, I don't have to.
So 21 there says, however, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. And that was the key verse there to pull into this context. And so in the context there we see that there was a demon that was too powerful, I guess, for his disciples to do it because they were lacking what? Right. And so what's Jesus' response to that?
How can a perverse generation, how long will he be with them?
Right. So he's saying, they're lacking the faith, and he says this is something that comes that has to come out, much prayer and fasting to be able to rebuke this kind of demon. So, what are some of the things that we can learn from this account? This really short account that he just mentions it in passing here. That prayer and fasting is involved with exercising this demon, practicing this miraculous gift. What can we draw from that?
I get from it that he's saying that by praying and fasting, that the more we do it, the more closer we come to him. And the more closer we come to him, the more faith grows inside us, which will help us overcome the war of evilness.
Okay. All right. Good. Anything else? What else can we see from this this instance here? What about? Go ahead.
I was saying would strengthen their faith. Because he said you have little faith.
Yes.
So with prayer and fasting, they can increase that faith and then you do these things. So he says nothing will be impossible for you. So if he says that if you had, as much faith as a grain of mustard seed, which is the smallest grain, the smallest seed, and they didn't have that because they couldn't do this, so they really have very little faith.
Okay.
I'm just making a comparison with you.
Janice?
And also it implies that you, for lack of a better word, inflict your body, your flesh, your faith strengthens. And this grain of a mustard seed, even though it's the smallest, one of the smallest seeds, when it grows, it's one of
Right.
the most abundant,
Right.
seeds.
Right. It's very large.
Yeah.
Okay. Possibly, is there times when faith alone is not enough? Maybe that's implied here, that that it required more than just alone, but it required them to pray and to fast as well. That's just a also that we see that there are times, and this is one of the times when fasting was necessary, and of course it's joined with prayer. Every time that we see this is accompanied with that. And so, is there any other thoughts on this one here before we move on to the next? Okay, so far we've talked about what Jesus has said about some instruction after he talked about prayer and gave the model prayer. He spoke about his disciples in relation to John's disciples, as well as this time when prayer and fasting was necessary. So, did the church fast? Do we have instances when the church fasts? Yes, we do. We do. Does anyone know any right now? Offhand, is anyone at one of them? Okay, the first one is Acts 13. Acts 13, we see the church at Antioch fasted. And does anyone know the circumstances in the context here? It's in verses 1 through 3. What's happening here?
They were about to set Paul and Barnabas.
Okay, they're about to send them on a journey, right? They send them on this missionary journey, and so before they choose, or before they make this decision and these sort of things, it said that they're fasting as a congregation there. Can someone read 13, 1 through 3?
Now in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, "Now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." And having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away.
Okay, so what are we learning from this instance? What's the purpose of their fasting here and their praying? Right? Right? They're having to make a big decision that has great spiritual implications. And so we see that fasting is appropriate at those sort of times. And we see also that they're fasting not as individuals here. They're fasting as a group. They're fasting as a congregation. So how do we harmonize fasting as a congregation to what Jesus was saying about fasting and not letting anybody know that you're fasting and those sort of things? I think we talked about this a little bit about prayer too, but how do we harmonize that? Katie?
So the times that he was telling them, that he was telling it to an individual first off, and he was telling them not to be doing it for show.
Right. Right. That's the key. That's the key. We are not doing it to be pleasing to men. So it's not saying that we're not to do it in a group, that we have to do it secretly, individually, per se, but it's saying we're not doing it for each other. We're not doing it to please men. Exactly. And so we see that they fasted in preparation of sending out Barnabas and Saul, and when they're fasting, when accompanied with prayer, can be done in a group, as we just mentioned. So, any other comments on this instance before we move on to the next? All right, the next one's the next chapter, chapter 14. We have the churches in Galatia here, and this time we have
And when they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, "We must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God." So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed.
all right. So we have another instance here, group setting, but what's different in this situation?
Well, in the other situation, going to set apart Paul and Barnabas, and so they fasted in prayer, they prayed and laid their hands on them and sent them off. And this one, they're appointing elders,
Mm-hmm.
so they use prayer and fasting
Okay.
to make a decision.
So that's what it seems like to me, that they're still making some sort of decision that has major spiritual implications. I can't tell whether the fasting and the praying happened before or after, but we know it's connected to this. And so we see again here that they're in a group, that it was a serious task of appointing the eldership, and that we also see that this was done in every church, as we know that Paul instructed the churches of Galatia that they were to do these things in the other churches as well. So this wasn't just a tradition, a Jewish tradition anymore. That this was something that was instructed also to the churches that were predominantly Gentile as well. And so we're moving past just Jewish tradition to see that there is actual examples of the congregations in the first century practicing fasting as a congregation. And we also see Paul. Paul is also an example that we have in fasting. Does anyone know where Paul mentions himself fasting? We have example, him mentioning this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 4 through 10, and he mentions it there in verse 5. He also mentions something very similar in 2 Corinthians 11:23. And so basically, from what I'm gathering here in these verses here, that this was something that was a mark of his ministering, of his ministry, of his being a preacher, a minister of Christ. That this was one of his marks among these other things, these other afflictions, that fasting was associated with this. And fasting is mentioned separately from normal hunger and thirst. So he says fasting, and then he also mentions hunger and thirst. So he's making a distinction there that it's more than just physical hungering and thirsting. That there's purpose. There's a deliberateness to it. Okay, so but in both here, he's mentioning this as part of his afflictions, part of the sufferings that he's going through that have these spiritual implications. to it. And then we have another instance in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And someone want to read that? 1 Corinthians 7:5. And let's draw some. Yes. Or if you look at it, read it in its context. 1 Corinthians 7:5. You can read 4. Yes. Yeah. That's fine.
Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
Okay, so we have another instruction here. This one's specifically directed to husbands and wives. And what's the circumstances surrounding this admonishment to pray? Oh, go ahead.
I'm a little confused. Maybe we can talk about it later. I didn't think that the early church practiced as a congregation fasting. Is that what you said, or is mine?
That's not what I said. That's what Acts chapter 13 and chapter 14 said. So it looks to me like they did.
I just don't get that way. Now, Christ assumed that his disciples were going to fast. And he said when you fast, you do it in secret. How can you be doing it in secret if you're doing it in a congregation?
But we brought that up there.
Between God and man, the individual, and how in a congregation.
Okay, does anyone want to answer that? How can we fast in secret and in the congregation? She's replying to Katie just made mention of it, but Katie had said too that they're doing it in secret is not that we're doing it to be pleasing to men, to do it for show, is what Katie had said, and so we see that these Christians there weren't doing it for show in Acts chapter 14 and 13, but they are doing it in.
Okay. Look at Matthew 6:17-18. 17. Jesus said that thou appear not unto men to fast. That's a violation of what Christ said to do.
If you go one verse before that, in 16, it says, "Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites," which is what it's referring to, because they, with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. He said, "Assuredly I say to you, they have their reward." But then he tells them, when you fast, anoint your head, that do not appear to men to be fasting. So he was comparing that to the way the hypocrites were doing it, to be seen of men.
The Pharisees were fasting twice a week at that period of time.
Sure.
But it was just their custom.
Right. It was an outward thing. It was a ritualistic thing. But if we look back, he says the same thing about praying. He says, when you pray, go into your closet, do it in secret, and your Father who's in the secret place will reward you openly. It's the same kind of verbiage, but that doesn't dismiss or make it invalid that we can pray as a congregation as well. And it's the same idea there. It's the purpose of it. We're not praying to be seen by men. We're not praying to be glorified by men. We're not fasting to be seen by men. We're not fasting to be glorified by men. And so I think there's no look there to whether we're praying or fasting, either way, as a congregation as a whole, or for individual as long as we're doing it for the right purpose. Is that? Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, giving is the same way. I mean, within that same chapter, he says,
Right.
when you give to your poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret. Now, how about as a congregation, do we give? Do we give on the first day of the week? Sure. But he says, do things in such a way that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing. Yet in the previous chapter, he said, let poor men in such a way that they may see your good works. So how do you there's not a contradiction here.
Right.
What he's doing is teaching a lesson on piety.
Right.
And
It's the heart.
And humility.
Right. The heart issue is what he is addressing. Meanwhile, did you have something else there?
Well, it's my understanding that the only time that fasting was a commandment, well, I guess we have examples to follow. If what you're saying is when was on the Day of Atonement when it became a part of Moses' God's law he gave to Moses. But in the New Testament, the practices of fasting for Jesus and his disciples was all different than
Right. Exactly.
the Pharisees and the sects.
But the physical action was similar, was the same. There with withholding food and drink, but the reason for it is what Jesus is getting at, and that's what we're getting at too. Dennis?
And in both cases, when the churches are fasting, they're trying to make a humongous decision
Right.
on their future. So by the church fasting together, they're getting their minds in the right place for the right reason to come together in unity to make a decision.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah, and I think this is it teaches a lot about not only the physical aspects of what the churches were doing at this time, but the gravity of these sort of things. I think sometimes, I know we don't have an eldership here, but a lot of times those things are taken. Some things that have major spiritual implications are not handled as serious as they often should. And I think that's another lesson we can glean from this, that these brethren, whether we decide we gather from all this that fasting is included in what we should be doing or not, they are taking these major spiritual decisions very seriously, and they were doing it in a way that they were coming together and they were trying their best to be pleasing to God. And these are the ways that it's showing us that they did it. Yes, Iman?
Christ never said the method or for what purpose, other than to part of our worship, are we? So we pray. We're not all fasting.
Right. We don't normally.
Was that just a custom that we just picked up from the Pharisees?
And those are all good questions, and those are all questions that we should be asking ourselves now. Should we be fasting? And that's the next questions that we're going to get to here momentarily. But first, I wanted to kind of recap to kind of bring us back to what we've learned so far. So far we've talked about of course, the Old Testament isn't binding on us today, but we can learn so much from the physical things that were happening in the Old Testament and carrying them over for our spiritual implications. There's so much. I mean, there's so much there. And so for the fasting in the Old Testament, only one fast, as was mentioned earlier, was specifically commanded in the Old Testament. That was on the Day of Atonement. But people often fasted when they wanted to hear their prayers, wanted God to hear their prayers in times of war, or the threat of it. They fasted. They fasted when loved ones were sick. They fasted when they were seeking for God's forgiveness. They fasted when they were faced with impending danger or doom. The purpose of such fasting was to humble themselves, and as the Hebrew idiom was actually, they would say afflicting their souls, and that was referred to as fasting. So when you look in Leviticus and you try to find the commandment for fasting for the Day of Atonement, you're not going to find that word in there because it's a similar idiom, but it's talking about afflicting one's soul. And so they were believing that such humiliation, this humbling of themselves, would be pleasing in God. It often was, as we see. Until we get, as was brought up last week, into the minor prophets, when I think that's when we see that shift, Meemaw. We see that shift from the true, proper, commanded ordinances to a ritualistic, something that was done for show. And we see that, sometime during that, and we see it move on into the New Testament. And so we see that fasting was fruitless when it was done ceremoniously, when it was done with no repentance, and that there was also no set principles governing the length or nature of fasting. We see that they fasted for a couple of days, a day. Moses fasted for 40 days. And so we see all of these different things. There are several for 3 days. And so there was no set principles or anything other than that one for the Day of Atonement. Yes, ma'am?
The hypocrites of that day would fast in public, as mentioned, with just a bit of chin shine.
Right.
They tried to look sad in order to look religious, and they just looked silly.
Look how pious I am.
So-
look at this affliction that I'm...
It's so easy for the church members to just a congregation, and I just don't see that yet.
Yeah, I think we could abuse any aspect of worship also.
I was only interested in the reason behind it, and it was to do between God and the individual man, and that's why he went with the secret business.
Sure, yeah, we certainly see that, but then we also see the congregations fasting when they're making major decisions as well. And we see that in Acts chapter 13 and 14. And so when we get into the New Testament, that the Lord fasted in the time of temptation, that he taught his disciples about fasting on several occasions, in which his disciples would fast, and that's after he is gone. And that there are times when the combination of fasting and prayer might be more advantageous than just prayer alone, and that the early church fasted in their service to the Lord when making these major decisions, and also that Paul regarded fasting as part of his ministry, as part of his Christian life. So, and lastly, we can gather that prayer and fasting often go hand in hand, and utilized whenever there was a strong desire for God's blessings and guidance. Anything else to add to that kind of bullet points of what we've covered so far? So let's ask the question, should a Christian fast today? Janice?
It depends.
Okay.
It depends on how bad you want it, how much you're hurting, how desperate you are. Are you willing to fast for it? Does it hurt you that much? Do you want to answer that much to show how you are pouring out your heart to God? That's what I say.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Yes?
Thank you, walking short of me.
Especially when should we? Yeah. So,
Okay. Steve?
It certainly is a good practice. I mean, the Bible talks much about the discipline of the body spirit-controlled person as opposed to a fleshly-controlled person. I think the principle is taught in Romans chapter 8. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in verse 27, Paul says, I discipline my body and make it my slave. And I tell you what, when it comes to the discipline of the body, fasting is a great practice in that. You know, there's a whole lot of other things that we are tempted with in this life. That there's nothing sinful about eating food when you're hungry. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we are able to practice discipline over our bodies in those things, you know, how much more well equipped will we be in disciplining our that will cause us to sin.
Okay, Sarah.
What Steve was saying about disciplining our bodies, it just kind of reminded me of what we were reading about the husband and wife. It was like telling us that, you know, we can abstain from each other when we're fasting. So we're not, you know, we're also disciplining our bodies in that way during the fasting. So that was it.
Not eating and abstaining from food, that I forget to pray and praise God. So haven't fasted in a while, but when I do fast, I need to remember that to keep my focus on praying God.
Right.
Not only an hour later, then I'm going to turn into that vegetable sandwich. You know, I need to control myself, my mind too.
Sure. And before we go any farther into the whys, I wanted to kind of present kind of where I've been coming from with this, because I went into this study as far as fasting with no real expectations as far as like should we or shouldn't we. I just wanted to see what the Bible said, and so I'm looking at it. Should we today? I think that when we're talking about authority, when we're talking about how we draw our authority, what are the bases on what we draw our authority by? Commands, right? What else? Examples and inferences, right? So we have those things. Do we have commands of fasting? I don't think so. I don't think there's any commands in there as far as a direct command. Do we have examples? Sure, we have examples. Do we have inferences? Yeah, I think we have a lot of inferences in there. And so to make a long story short, we don't have very much time. I would say yes, but I wouldn't bind it on anybody else. But it certainly is something that I'm going to be looking into further, contemplating, and trying to incorporate into my habitual Christian lifestyle and those things. That being said, I do want to mention what was the next verse in 1 Corinthians when it's talking about the husbands and wives, and it's talking about fasting. And this is why I say I can't be dogmatic about this, because of what Paul says here. Paul talks about fasting. He says in 1 Corinthians 7:5, do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, and that so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In verse 6, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. Okay, so we have here, at least is not a commandment. We see this in here. But what is Paul saying here? Why is Paul saying I'm encouraging, I'm admonishing, I'm saying this as a concession to consider to do these things?
Well, he also goes on to say that he wishes that all men were like him and didn't marry.
Right.
So even him saying that, some people are going to say that means that you can't get married.
Sure. But we see, what it's saying there. He's saying that if you can devote your whole life to the gospel, that's even better. But not everyone's going to be able to do that. And he's saying the same thing here, I think, with prayer and fasting. If you are going to do it, don't do it. Don't do it for a long time. Do it for a time and come back and make it a time of abstinence. And I think that's what fasting is also. It's not necessarily, we think of food, but sometimes when we're talking about it in a general sense, it can be a general abstaining from things. But I think when we're talking about how they're fasting here, it is a withholding of food. And we are running out of time. I really want to finish all of this. I still have a little bit more here that I want to cover. And so, Lord willing, next week we'll just cover a little bit more, and then we'll just jump into the next prayer things. But are there any other comments that you want to make before we close out?
With what Paul said there, that he said that as a concession, not a commandment.
Right.
But then I remember the words of Jesus when he said, I will give you the keys to the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound on earth, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in earth. So I think he had the authority to say that, but he didn't after whatever it was loose.
Okay. Sure, and I think we can hopefully this will be helping us to rethink our ideas and our traditions, so to speak, and examine what we're doing, why we're doing it, and ultimately to increase our Christian maturity, to grow closer to God, and to help each other make it to heaven. And that's what we're all trying to do here. So, Lord willing, we're just going to finish up this. Next week, prepare for Nehemiah. We're going to be talking about Nehemiah's prayer. And that is, do I have it written down here? I think it's in chapter 1. I don't know the verse offhand. I think it's in the very beginning there. So we're going to be talking about Nehemiah and his prayerfulness.